Hello everyone and welcome to the first part of this third episode of A Look Into. Totally on time, right? Not really. Anyway, today we'll talk about a streamlined steam locomotive series built as a twin cab, while also lacking the actual forward cab. Yeah. In the late 19th century, trains were the transport of the future. After linking large towns and cities together, the networks expanded to more rural areas and became what we call now tramways, now linking small villages and farmers to the main lines. That trend was extremely important, and lines that would today see no passenger at all were operating at great success, and even unnamed places were linked to the world. Most of the companies running these lines were not very rich at all, creating the need for locomotives to use already existing right-of-ways and streets, so small rolling stock, meter gauge or less, was preferred, working often in mixed traffic. That also pushed the companies to use streamlined locomotives, mainly to ensure their working parts wouldn't get damaged by street dust and protected locals. People getting in the running gear isn't really good. It also was a measure to stop the engines from scaring horses, still widely used at the time. That type of locomotive, with one platform on each end, permitted to always have the engineer on the forward side, permitting him to emergency brake if anything happened forward of the locomotive that it otherwise not even see on a standard one. In this context, in 1882, were created the Tramway de la Sarthe, running what would become with the years a 416 km long network. The lines were created in distinct three batches, and all of that happened in the west of France. At their creation, the company had more than enough financial resources to become important, and showed this goal by building a gigantic central station in Le Mans, and using their own right-of-way instead of having their tracks near roads in a lot of cases. That created wonderful bridges, literal works of art at the time, and they were all designed by the same guy, Mr. Louis-Auguste Harel de la Noë. So I believe it's now time to speak about the locomotives themselves. The orders were divided into three batches, one for each network, with the first one being a mess of different builders, from Corpel-Louvet to Tubize, built from 1881 to 1888, with the preference from the company going to Tubize designed locomotives built by A&F, of which the numbers 15 to 19 were the first Blanc-Misseron builds. The second batch were built between 1896 and 1898, overall very similar in design, having one platform at each end but a single cab, and they were fully streamlined. This interesting non-feature had a simple reason: the company had turntables on each one of the lines, and having a single platform was cheaper. Also built in multiple batches, the dimensions and capacity varied a bit, but we can still pull some overall characteristics. Those locomotives were very simple in design and not that late, thus they weren't any advanced tech on them, no superheater, no compounding, anything, apart on number 20 to 61 that had 71 serve winglet tubes, instead of 103 basic boiling tubes, thus increasing their efficiency by 10%, which is quite good. The last batch, built from 1910 to 1913, used locomotives very similar in design, but without the streamlining and with a more basic steam locomotive shape. It is also interesting to note that number 62 was equipped with an unusual Doctor steam generator that had few disadvantages and was quickly abandoned. Characteristics for first and second batch locomotives are as follows. They were 4.7 meters long, 2 meters wide and 3 meters tall without counting the buffers, with a 1.8 meter wheelbase. The drivers were of 0.832 meter diameter, and the boiler produced around 700 kilowatts, with 71 CF tubes or 103 standard tubes. And the firebox had a 0.64 square meter grate area. The water capacity on the boiler is of around 1.5 cubic meter, while capacity inside tanks was also 1.5 cubic meter, and the coal capacity was around 500 kilograms. So those locomotives were two-cylinder simple expansion, and had a valve-shares distribution and were capable of a pulling force equaling 1.8 ton, which was around 100 horsepower for their weight. Their max speed was of around 45 km per hour, though in service they probably never exceeded 25 or 30. They weighted around 12.8 tons empty, pulling 70-ish ton trains composed of 2 to 3 passenger cars and a few freight cars. The networks also used vacuum brakes on their trains, which was quite needed, and some companies even later kinda forgot that. Overall, even though they looked quite interesting, they were very basic locomotives. So yeah, they are still quite interesting though. Lastly, I'll try to tell a small timeline before the 1950s. Following what we know about the different batches, it is important to note that later locomotives didn't replace the older ones, for the most part at least, and thus they all had their own line on which they operated. They were not switched out with newer models, for example. This means most locomotives, if they weren't wrecked or anything like that, operated for sometimes more than 5 decades, which is extremely long, 3 round trips per day, well maintained by their crews and permitting thousands of people to live better than they could before. That until their line closed, which, depending on the section, happened between 1932 and sometimes even before, and the 1st of March 1947, when the Tramway de Sarthe as a metric network ceased to exist. The World Wars gave a bit of reprieve to the network, reactivating for a time the sections that were already abandoned and still operable, but at the aforementioned date, it was the end. After that, well, locomotives not yet sold were stationed in Le Mans or other stations, awaiting their final voyage to the scrapyard, of which were number 16 and 60. Few others were surprisingly bought by quarries and mines, as was number 51. But hope was not completely lost, at least for those 3 locomotives, 16, 51 and 60, and their survival to this day will be the focus of our second chapter of this episode. Until then, stay well and see you soon.